Yeah, it's a connection. That's good. Okay. Maybe become a secret handshake of Armstrong Bible Chapel. Okay. So we're going to do, we're moving into a series. I think I'll stay down here today because I'm not going to interact too much with the screen. If I'm up there, then, anyways, I'll stay down here. But this picture, in Psalm 91, there's this picture of dwelling in God, and God is over top of those he loves and he knows, and it's almost like an eagle protecting her chicklets, right? And so this is the picture that we get in Psalm 91 of God knowing us and us coming to him and somehow being in the presence of him changes us. And it also, there's some sort of protection that happens where he guides the direction, he guides the pathway of our life. And so what I want to do is, I thought about it, I prayed about it, I talked to my one buddy who likes spiritual disciplines a lot, and I said, I'm going to start a new series, and he said, well, what you should probably do is explain what spiritual disciplines are and what they're not. Because if I don't do that, we can go on a real tangent, and I can build a bunch of Pharisees, and you guys are going to be spiritually stuck, and it's going to be like, you shouldn't have even done that series. So what I want to do, I thank you for Elijah for reading that passage. This Sunday, I'm just going to give us a lens or a perspective that I think is really helpful for how we approach all other spiritual disciplines. And other weeks, we're going to just pick on one spiritual discipline. We're going to unpack it. And I want it to be pretty practical. I want you guys' interaction. Even in this service, this sermon, I want a lot of feedback because you guys are going to help me design the rest of the series, okay? So the first thing I want to start with is how many people go to a show and shine in Armstrong every year? Is there a show and shine? Yeah? How many people in this congregation have a collectible car? An antique or a hot rod or something that they're working on, they're fixing up? Okay? Ethan? Yeah. Okay. So what is it about old cars? Sometimes we buy a car and we just keep it in that state, but what's it about you buy a car and you fix it up and you bring it to the restoration, back to what it was? Why do we like that so much? Yeah, it's nostalgia. Okay, I don't want to be too stereotypical and say that guys only like hot rods, but what about antique stores? Do some people like antique stores? Yeah? And you can go in there and you can buy all these things that are from the turn of the century and you put them in your house and you just like, man, this is awesome. I want this in my house. Okay. Kelsey and I have been looking for houses in Armstrong, and we were kind of looking at heritage houses too. There's one for sale, and we're like, it's so cute, but that's a lot of work. I think more work than we're ready to do. But there's that idea that we can restore it and turn it back into like, man, you walk into that house and it's the 1920s again, right? What about this one here? Who knows what reclaimed wood is? Right? So you go to a barn, or you can go to some stores that have reclaimed wood, and you go there, and behind that shelf, or the guy's bed, it's all reclaimed wood. On this one, that reclaimed wood's become the focal point of the living room. Right? It's pretty cool. Look at that bench. That bench is like, I don't even know what kind of wood that was before, but look at what it's turned into. Here's one more. Isn't that neat? Some people think that maybe looks ugly. I think that looks pretty cool with all that beat up wood that's been repurposed into something else. So I want that to be kind of the image that we're going to bring when we look at this passage today about reclaimed wood. There's this idea where we're reigniting or giving dignity or purpose or majesty to something that was about to go into a landfill or eventually just completely rot. Now it's the focal point of the room. Right? Can you guys get that image? So I sent out that email. I didn't expect you guys to be nerdy enough to read that big thing I put at the end, but if you guys did, that's from that audio book I put on our website from 400 AD. And he's talking about that humans as a civilization, as a species, we were kind of unraveling and we were becoming less than what we were meant to be. And that Jesus, he's saying, when you have a painting, you have to, if the painting gets wrecked, you have to have the original person that you're drawing the portrait of sit back down and they repaint off that picture. And so that's what Jesus came to do, is be that image that we were falling away from what our image of God himself is, and Jesus had to come and re-image us. So I want us to hold on to this idea that we were made for something beautiful and that God is reclaiming us and wants to do something powerful in us. That's what spiritual formation is. That's what these disciplines are about, is God saying, you're about to go to the landfill and I'm going to take you and make you the focal point of my living room. Okay? Let's hold on to that image. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this passage hopefully quickly, and then I want us to I'm going to unpack and explain how this should be a lens for spiritual disciplines, okay? So I have it on there in the NLT. I'm going to read out of a different one. I'm going to read out of the NIV here. And I might interact with those colors, but I just want you to see all these verses are in contrast to those verses, okay? So I'm just going to read it and we'll just talk about it. And then hopefully we can kind of set parameters and a kind of a direction for we'll use it as a tool for all the other Sundays. So Paul in Ephesians, the way Paul writes is he's saying everything that God has done for you and in you and through you and all this powerful stuff is Ephesians 1-3. And in the last half, he's saying, so because that's true, you have to live this way. And then he gives a whole bunch of direction on this is what God wants from you in different things. And this passage that we're going to read today, he's talking about our mindset. So I tell you this and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity with a continual lust for more. Okay, so Paul is saying that you guys have thought and acted a certain way for a long time. He's talking to the Ephesians people, and he's saying you didn't grow up knowing God, but now that you do, there's this opportunity to live differently. And he's saying that he says that there's a futility, or in the NLT it says that there's this hopelessness, this confusion about what life's all about. Okay? And so I really like that word futility. And in the Greek, that word is kind of like this emptiness or this lostness or no sense of direction. It's kind of like there's no anchor and anything goes. And so do you guys remember in Ecclesiastes where the main theme is like meaningless? Everything was meaningless. And the guy's like looking through and he's like, this world doesn't make any sense. Well, Paul in here in this passage, what he's saying is that people who don't know God, what ends up happening is when they kick God out of their life, God's life and God's light goes with him. Okay, so it's not like God's like, okay, I'm leaving, you can have the flashlight and the oxygen mask. I'll leave those with you and I'm going to go. But the life and the light of what it means to be a human are tied up in God's presence himself. And if that goes, humans are left to themselves. Right? And so that's what Paul's saying is that if God leaves the house, you're left to yourself. And so it's kind of like a cause and effect thing that he does in these verses. Do you guys see that? So the first thing he's saying is that our minds kind of move in their own direction and we start to have a darkness in our understanding. That light is gone. And then also there's this like depravity in our practices. Can you guys see that in those verses? There's kind of a cause and effect. If you kick God out of your life, your minds start to focus on what you want and it starts to change the whole thought process. Right? And so the next thing he says is that there becomes this depravity in practice. Like the way our desires work, our desires are very good and our desires are meant to connect us to God, but also to have love in the proper channels. But if there's no anchor above that, if there's no direction, what ends up happening is it's called misguided love. And so a lot of the things in the world that cause pain are just misguided love. and misguided desires. So we go after things in a way that's not in the right channel, right? So it's like trying to get a square peg into a round hole, right? And so humans are on this constant process of trying to figure out the best way to live life, but we don't seem to get it right. And we're just constantly slamming square pegs into round holes. And so this is what Paul's saying. This is the way we used to live. This is the way people who don't have this light shining on them and can't see. It's like when you go to a maze and you look inside the maze, you're in the maze, you can't see anything. But if you go on one of those towers, you can see the whole thing. Right? You can see the whole thing. It's not hard to get through. Paul's saying that those people who don't know God, they're in the middle of the maze and it doesn't make any sense. Now, these verses 17 to 19, I think there's an illustration that could really help, that kind of describes where our world is at right now. And I got to be really careful the way I use this illustration because I got to be careful the way I phrase it. But right now, I think that something that describes verses 17 to 19, in our world right now, there's do you guys know a rock star named Billie Eilish? Billie Eilish? Okay, so I'm going to be really careful with this, but right now in the news, she is saying that the adult film industry has wrecked her life. Okay, so she's this 19-year-old girl, and she's actually pretty insightful, and she said that she's been involved with that stuff since she's about 11. But what's happened is she's saying it's a disgrace, and it's completely changed her perspective on the world, and it's just ruined it, and it's causing death. And so it's what these verses are talking about. When you move away, when a society moves away from God, desires and lustful pleasures, anything that you want to pursue becomes the direction that a human being lives for. And so she's getting a lot of heat right now from that industry. And they're saying, well, no, it's not a bad thing. But what's really interesting is, like, growing up, like maybe 20 or 30 years ago, that whole industry was looked at kind of like a guilty pleasure. Like, it's something that people shouldn't participate in, but it's kind of like eating a donut or the second or third or fourth box of donuts, or smoking or drinking too much. And it's like something that we shouldn't do, but everybody kind of does it. But what's happened is our society in the last 20 or 30 years has got to the point where it's actually not just bad or neutral, it's almost commendable. So if you read like Cosmopolitan magazine, or if you read Men's Health, they actually say it's a good thing to participate in. If you want to build your marriage, get involved and start participating in that industry. I'm serious. So that's all I want to say about that. But Billie Eilish is this 19-year-old girl, and she's got all this insight where she's saying, anecdotally, I just know it's wrecking my life. And so what Paul is saying is, you guys don't have to live that way. It's actually very destructive. Not just talking about that industry, but where your whole life is about going after desire. Going for desire and just saying, there is no bigger purpose, so I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. And if anybody gets in my way, I'll just move them out of the way. And so Paul, he looks in Ephesians chapter 4, and right after this, he contrasts that old way of life, the way where we're led along by whatever we want to do, to a different way. This is where spiritual formation comes in. And this is what he says in verse 20. He says, you, however, did not come to know Christ that way. Surely you heard of him and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. Right? So these are people who maybe haven't met Jesus face to face. These are people maybe who've only heard about Jesus, but they're experiencing Jesus through his Spirit. And they're living in Ephesus. And he's saying, you guys didn't actually meet him face to face, but when you learned about Jesus, what did he teach you? Did he teach you that whatever you want to do with your life, God just wants to bless that? That do whatever you want to do, that God is just excited to help you live out all your pleasures. And he says, no, like you were taught to deny yourself, that God has this real life that he's waiting for, that human beings can't see intrinsically. They need to discover it with him. And so he says, here's a couple things here. He just says, you were taught with regard to your old way of life, to put it off, this old way of life which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, and to be made new in the attitude of your minds, to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Right? So if you have this picture of this wood, right? God's looking and he's saying, like, man, you guys have been rescued. You guys have been reclaimed. And so this anchor that we have in our life, it can't be ourselves. Our culture and our world is forming us in a certain direction. And Paul's saying, what you need to do is allow God to unform you out of that and form you into something else. Do you guys see that in these verses? This idea of being reclaimed? Right? He's saying that the world deceives us, that when human beings just are by themselves, we get confused about the purpose of life and we go after whatever pleases us inside, but we don't actually have something that's really powerfully moving us in a direction that will give us real life. Does that make sense? Do you guys kind of see where Paul's going with that big contrast he paints? That if you want to live for yourself and live in darkness, that's not actually the way of Jesus. The way of Jesus is to continually to be made new into something different. Okay, so that's just a really brief overview of Paul's understanding of what's called spiritual formation. Taking off what is old, taking off that which is broken and reclaiming and putting on what is new. So I just hope, let's keep going here. What spiritual disciplines are. Does anybody know? Does anybody want to just name some spiritual disciplines? If you think about books that you read and different ones that come up. Does anybody know what we're talking about? Prayer? Silence and solitude? Fasting. Does anybody know what I'm talking about with spiritual disciplines? Yeah, there's sometimes people talk about charity or almsgiving or, some of the stuff that Peter Scazzero's talked about, like prayer of examine. Some of this emotionally healthy stuff is actually spiritual disciplines. So what I want us to help understand is that we just did a series on Psalm 90, right? And what was that psalm about? It's about humility, right? And so it's about recognizing that God has a different way of life that he has made for us. And we have to move in there with him, that we can't do it on ourselves, right? That it's actually the life of God, him living his life through us, that changes everything. We can't do it by ourselves. So we need to bring that into Psalm 91. Otherwise, what happens is spiritual disciplines can become something very bad. I'm trying to scare you guys, but so spiritual disciplines, so like things like fasting, things like meditation, different things like that. Some of the Eastern religions practice some spiritual disciplines, and I think you can practice some spiritual disciplines. You can practice without involving God at all. And there can be some health benefits, and psychologically and relationally, there can be some things, but that's not what Christian disciplines are. Christian disciplines aren't self-actualization. It's not about becoming an awesome person at life, becoming independent so you can become powerful and you can be just great at life. Okay? And spiritual disciplines aren't also a way to force God's hand. Right? It's almost like if you do all these good things and if you're saying all your prayers or whatever, then you've kind of leveraged God and God has to do something now for you. That's not the point of spiritual disciplines, and they're also not you saving yourself. So based on this text, does anybody want to kind of, what we've seen here, what are spiritual disciplines? Like, what are their purpose? Why has God given them to us? Based on what we've seen in these verses. Somebody want to just expand on that?
Rhythms and practices into your life to make space for connection with God and to be led by his Spirit instead of being led by your sinful flesh.
Mm-hmm.
And then also to take on a way of seeing the world so that you can understand the culture that you live in and how God, the way of Jesus is countercultural to the world.
Mm-hmm.
So to put rhythms and practices into your life so you don't get sucked into the culture around you.
Yeah. So Rachel pretty much just stole all my thunder and I can't finish the sermon. We're going to see some slides in a second here. So spiritual disciplines, if you're a picture person, let's think about this. They're kind of like a doorway to grace. Spiritual disciplines themselves aren't grace. They're a doorway we can walk into. And when we walk through that doorway, it's almost like there's this garden that's waiting for us, and God and us build that garden together. And we go to that place so that we can meet with Him, and He Himself can change us and transform us. Okay? So
you need to know
yeah.
that you have to throw off your old stuff.
Yeah.
You have to be aware of that situation.
Yeah.
It just doesn't happen all of a sudden, oh, today I'm going to be spiritual.
Yeah. So what Jerry's saying, okay, can you put on your new self without taking off the old? I think that's something Jerry's saying that's very interesting.
That's not the way you restore a car.
Yeah. No, you can't just put the new stuff on the old stuff.
Yeah, you can't do gallon overhaul.
Yeah, what about just putting Bondo over rust? Can you do that? Yeah? Yeah, I guess you can, yeah. So I think what we're going to see in these spiritual disciplines, I want us to really set these up right, that there's this futility in our world. So Paul is not saying this stuff because he wants to hammer on these people like he's just so frustrated with them. I think what he's doing is he's saying there's this new life available for you, and here's the new mind that you get, here's the new practices, and they give life. He's not beating them up. He's saying you don't have to live like that anymore. True life is waiting for you if you want it. If you wanted Ephesians, I'm telling you, Ephesians, this is where all the life is. Okay? And so, let's jump ahead here. This is where Rachel kind of stole my thunder. I have some ideological, I call them futilities, because Paul talks about when we move God out of the picture, other thought processes come in. Okay? And what I want to say is, all four, I'm going to put 4 on there. I want you guys to give me more of them. And I'm going to explore more of them, and then we're going to tackle those through spiritual disciplines. I have 4 right here. Secular humanism, consumerism, hedonism, and individualism. I got a question. Does a fish who's in the water, do they realize that they're wet? The fishes don't. Do they realize that they're wet? And so I think the way culture works is we breathe it and we absorb it, we drink it, and we don't even recognize it. And Paul's saying that there's a futility in the way that the world thinks, which is actually destructive. It's super destructive. And the problem is we breathe it in so much that when we go read the Bible, we actually impute or we put that on the Bible. We use it as a lens. Okay, these are cultural things. Paul talks about ripping down these strongholds. So I just want to look at them. The world is forming you. And it's not like everybody in the world has got this evil plan and there's like, what's his name from Austin Powers? Not Mini-Me, Dr. Evil. It's not like necessarily that there's like this big plan to get us to become secular humanists. But it's when God is removed out of the picture, humans have to substitute and think about new ways of thinking. So does anybody know what secular humanism is? Have you guys heard of that term before? It's probably like the biggest, called zeitgeist or spirit of the age. And so secular humanism is atheistic, but its effect on Christianity is very strong. We don't even recognize it all the time. Secular humanism is that God isn't real, and so that the highest form of life that exists is humanity. Unless we meet extraterrestrials someday, humanity is the highest evolved form. Humanity is the highest that there is, so humans are the end of all things. Right? And so when sometimes in Christianity, we get sucked into thinking that God is a means to our end. Right? And so sometimes our worship songs can be singing about us, singing about God. And the focus is on us, it's not on God. Do you guys see that? Or sometimes when we read the Bible, we say, what's my benefit, or God exists for me? And so we read the whole Bible in a wrong perspective. And so Jesus wants to, like Jerry says, take that off, and he wants to give us a new perspective on that. And consumerism too, like maybe you guys are reading these as I'm going, if they're not too small. But this idea of like capitalism, I don't know if capitalism is bad per se, but what it has done is it's caused us to be very transactional. Everything in life is purchasing. You can purchase relationships. You can purchase, everything in life is purchasable. And so everything becomes a matter of how much. How much does this cost? How much am I going to have to give up to get that? And it influences our relationships. It influences our understanding and our interaction with God. Do you guys see that? So we unconsciously take these things to the Bible, right? But Jesus, like that's why Paul's saying, when you learned about Jesus, Jesus wasn't like the middle column. Jesus is completely like the right column. And so in Paul's day, he would maybe have different ones, but these are 4 things. Here's some more. Hedonism, that pleasure is the highest goal, that all pleasure in all its forms is virtuous. Right? And the ultimate evil is to deny pleasure. And individualism. So what we want to do is when we look at these spiritual disciplines in the next couple of weeks, we want to unform, like Jerry's saying, take off a bad perspective, a bad mindset, a bad practice, but we also want to put on a new mindset and a new practice. But it's not just the practice itself. It's where you meet with God and He Himself changes us into this. So I have a question. I'm gonna open it up. I'm gonna get my little thing here. I'm gonna write this out because otherwise I'm gonna forget. But I want you guys to help me build the sermon series. So I'm just gonna delete this off of here. What would you guys say are some other big isms in our world that affects the way we think about God, the way we think about church or life? That maybe taint our view. It's like if you got glasses on and you put red lenses on, or if you put green lenses on or blue lenses, what's altering our perception of reality?